Check 1 2 1 2 3 4 5. Great. Zoom, ready to roll. Dr. Navarro, thank you so much for joining the Realignment. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for coming.
So, Dr. Navarro, you got to tell us a little bit about your background. You, I think, more than any, or almost one of the intellectual godfathers of the Realignment itself. How did you come to hold the views that you did? And, was your background informed by it, where you grew up, et cetera? Just tell us a little bit about that story.
So I think one of the important experiences of my life was being in the Peace Corps in Southeast Asia back in the mid-'70s. And what was interesting about that was kind of an up-close and personal look at what they call the Chinese diaspora. The Chinese spreading across Asia, having a major role in the commercial interests of countries, rice mills, businesses, whatever, Thailand, Malaysia, Laos, Burma. I found it interesting at the time, and then I just put that in my back pocket for 30 years. But I was teaching at a business school, folks your age, who were getting their MBAs at night and on the weekends, so-called fully employed MBAs. This was about 2002, 2003. And I started noticing they were losing their jobs. And I was a macroeconomist teaching macro, and it was like, this is interesting. And then all things kind of led to China.
What industry were they typically employed in?
Across the board, but this was Irvine, California, the heart of tech in this country, both chip tech and health tech and everything in between, right? So for them to lose their jobs, this wasn't like Ohio factory jobs. These were like high-tech jobs.
So what do you owe that to, sir?
Let me finish, because this was what was interesting about it. It's like at the time, I basically took a year to study the problem. I did this thing called the China Price Project. And out of that, I identified a mercantilist and protectionist Chinese economic model that had different components to it. And the prevailing theory at the time was that China was winning simply because of cheap labor. And my research, which was the first research of any of this kind on it, debunked that theory. Yeah, they had cheap labor, but that was less than half of their competitive advantage. It was the intellectual property theft, the sweatshop labor, the environmental pollution havens, and it was like, how did they get away with that? And then it was like, okay, they got into the World Trade Organization in 2001. They got access to all the world markets, and this thing's unfolded. So if you fast forward to today, the books I wrote a book in 2006, Coming China Wars, widely ridiculed as hyperbole at the time. And today it reads like the government report, right? So, long answer to that question, but my overriding interest was macroeconomic in nature. Why was the U.S. economy slowing down? Why were we losing our manufacturing base? Why were wages stagnating? And what puzzled me is Bush didn't get it. Obama and Biden didn't get it. Donald J. Trump got it.
So tell us a little bit about that story in particular, because I think that's one of the things about China is that the neoliberalism that was used to inform the policies towards China are truly bipartisan in nature, and they also really permeate academia. So as being a lone voice kind of in that field, why is it that A, you were able to identify this, and B, why is it that people were so resistant to this idea really until 2016?
I think part of the answer is that I wasn't infected by the groupthink. I just came along as a macroeconomist, looked at the chessboard and go, oh, okay, this is obvious. I mean, it was obvious. As soon as you looked at it for long enough, I was like, oh yeah, that's obvious. I think the fundamental issue here that trapped everybody else was, going back to Nixon and Kissinger, was the idea that if you simply engaged economically with China, they would turn into this peaceful democracy. And there was at least some reason to believe that. I mean, that's what happened with Taiwan. That's what happened with South Korea. That's what happened with some countries in Europe. But what the foreign policy establishment didn't understand is that there was just a simply different set of dynamics going on. Tiananmen Square in '89 was like the turning point. It's like when everybody should have realized that the economic engagement theory was broken. Because at that point, China and their leaders made a decision to go full metal jacket totalitarian. Now that was done. They had a choice. They looked at what happened to the Soviet Union and said, no, we don't want to do that. We're going to do this. And at that point, there was a deal made with the Chinese people that basically said, hey, we're going to get you some jobs and money. Just keep your mouth shut.
So there's a debate about whether or not the economic changes you're talking about were inevitable, right? So some people think that the reason why we lost all these jobs, the reason why a lot of the MBAs who you were working with, the reason why people in the middle of the country lost their jobs is because economic times were changing. A lot of the reasons that we were so successful post-World War II was our rival economies were on the ground. We had this sort of unique moment. It seems to me you're suggesting that wasn't true, that this was actually a set of active policy choices that led that to happen. What were the choices that were made in the 1990s, so post-Tiananmen Square, that sort of pushed the things to that point?
Well, I think you need to think broader about it rather than just a China problem. But the choices basically begin with the World Trade Organization, and before that, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which was the predecessor to that. Right. The central philosophy after World War II, and this was bipartisan, was that trade liberalization would be the way to grow the U.S. and world economies, right? Straight out of the Ricardian textbook. So we as a country decided to take the lead on that, and we basically led with our chin, which is to say that in order to coax all the other countries of the world to lower their trade barriers, both non-tariff barriers and tariffs, we led by lowering ours. And so we went through successive rounds of negotiations at the GATT, as they call it, and things came down. But at one point, the music stopped, and we were stuck in an organization called the World Trade Organization, where our tariffs are the lowest of any major country. And by rule and fiat of the WTO, this thing called most favored nation, other countries it's perfectly legal for them to charge higher tariffs. So what is the sense of us having a tariff on German autos and the Germans having a tariff that's 4 times higher? That makes absolutely no sense. And I did a study at the White House that showed over 100 countries across 500,000 product lines, other countries charge us higher tariffs over 2/3 of the time. I mean, it's just stunning. And we let them do that, all right? So feed that into then the NAFTA in 1994, which was ironically supposed to keep Mexicans in Mexico right, and prosper. But in fact, it set off a huge illegal migration flow. It led to our capital going south, their human capital coming north. Was tremendously destructive to the U.S. economy. And then we doubled down in 2001, letting China into the World Trade Organization. And you can hypothesize as to why it happened. You can blame the multinationals who basically offshored the jobs under the flag of free trade and under the propaganda that we would benefit from that. You could make that argument. You could make the argument that the politicians themselves truly believed that this would be a path to a better future and simply didn't understand the economics. But at the end of the day, it is what it is, and it doesn't work. And Donald J. Trump knows it doesn't work, and he's the guy changing things.
And so to that point, I mean, you are the director of the Office of Trade and Manufacturing Policy. What does that actually mean? What is it that your office tries to do, and what are you been trying to do in the 3 years you've been in the administration?
So my focus is on the nobility of America, which is to say the men and women in blue collars who work with their hands. That's who I focus on. And if you think about the Biden years, 8 years of economic stagnation, they lost 200,000 manufacturing jobs. And during that time, as those jobs were going out, we heard a drumbeat from academia, from the mainstream press, from the politicians themselves saying that the structure of the economy had changed forever and those jobs were gone and they weren't coming back. Well, guess what? Less than 3 years in, we've created over 500,000 manufacturing jobs. Now, how is that done? How does President Trump do that? Certainly, part of what I do is to act in a synergistic role with Ambassador Robert Lighthizer as the USTR to
Trade representative for those.
U.S. trade representative to fulfill a number of the campaign promises President Trump made in June of 2016 as a candidate, which is renegotiate the awful South Korea deal that Hillary Clinton was responsible for as Secretary of State. Check that box. Renegotiate NAFTA. President Trump's done that. We're just waiting for Nancy Pelosi to decide whether she can do more than simply run an impeachment circus. Check that box. We have done a deal with Japan, which basically justifies the withdrawal from the Trans-Pacific Partnership because we were able to achieve with a bilateral negotiation with Japan exactly the same benefits we would have gotten under the TPP without having to surrender our auto industries. So you have a question?
Yeah. So, but with the TPP though, and what I like about your point is that there's a broader picture than just China with these trade policies. But wasn't one of the arguments for the TPP that it was a broader coalition of countries that would balance against China's economic sort of power?
So here's the thing. One of my favorite expressions of the president, which was in the 2017 National Security Strategy, is that if you sacrifice economic security for national security, you wind up losing both. And in this context, what drove me absolutely crazy listening to people talk about TPP who knew nothing about economics and trade was that somehow this was going to be a geopolitical weapon against the Chinese. Well, the reality is, even if you bought into that, it wasn't going to work because even though China was going to be outside the TPP, what they were going to do was basically set up shop in countries inside the TPP and hollow out our economy. Vietnam was basically going to be the tip of their spear. We were going to see the whole auto and auto parts industry move to Vietnam, and if whatever China wasn't putting in Vietnam, Japan was going to put on Japan. But let me finish your question because the point here is that even though I do a lot on trade. It's not most of what I do. So let me run through some of the stuff. Arms transfer policy. I played a role in the new arms transfer policy of the administration, which is designed to, on a more proactive way, sell defense systems to our partners and allies. Okay, so this is pure economic security. It is national security. If we sell F-16s to Bahrain and Morocco, Slovakia, and Bosnia, okay, that strengthens those allies. It strengthens the alliances in the regions that they're in, whether it's NATO or the Persian Gulf. It means fewer boots on the ground for U.S. personnel. And in that particular case, it meant a new F-16 production line in Greenville, South Carolina, with 400 new employees in Greenville and 16,000 new jobs across 41 states. Right? So, arms transfer. I work a lot on making sure, for example, when the defense budget was set, there'll be people looking at the big picture number of like how much we spend. What I was doing was going into the line items and making sure that Marinette, Wisconsin had money for the littoral combat ship so that it can bridge to the frigate competition. I made sure that Lima, Ohio, and York, Pennsylvania had money for the combat vehicles, and I made sure that Oshkosh, Wisconsin was able to have longevity for the Joint Tactical Light Vehicle. And through those kinds of things, surgically, we create jobs at the micro level. I work on shipyards. We're Philly shipyard went from over 1,000 workers, great blue-collar jobs, down to less than 100. We're building that back up. Work with the Maritime Administration Agency, Defense Department, the Building Trades Labor Union, and the shipyard owners to get them to change their business model. They were only doing new ships, which are hard to come by in the bidding process. We hedged their bets with getting them repair work now, and we've got hundreds of people that have been employed, and we're moving right up the chain. So you ask me what I do, this is the kind of stuff I do. I try to fix problems that are going to help blue-collar people have jobs.
Well, what I'm hearing from you is really not just a focus on the ideology itself, but also the deep implementation and the intrinsic nature, I think, of trade policy and economic policy with our defense industrial base, how this all comes together. But one of the things that we also talk about here on the podcast a lot is about trade, the very nature of trade itself. So free trade ideology has been thrown around. It's almost conventional wisdom at this point to question it. But what is free trade, and what does an ideal trading system look like in a Peter Navarro worldview?
So, fair, balanced, and reciprocal trade is what we need to have. If you look at China, for example, as the antithesis of that, I've referred to what I call the 7 deadly structural sins. This is what we're trying to do in our negotiations with them, and it's a misnomer to call what we're doing a trade negotiation, because it's not really. But let's look at what they do, and that's none of it should be a part of free trade, right? So, cyber intrusions into our business networks to steal our trade secrets, that's number one. Doesn't belong in free trade. Intellectual property theft to the tune of several $100 billion a year. That's not free trade. Forced technology transfer as a condition of market access to the Chinese market. Not free trade. Massive dumping of products that are unfairly subsidized into our markets to put our factories and workers and enterprises out of work. Not free trade. State-owned and state-financed enterprises roaming the globe competing with corporations. Now, who's going to win that battle? Not free trade. Manipulation of currency to gain competitive advantage, one of the most powerful weapons in the mercantilist arsenal. Not free trade. And then as a seventh issue, which I think it's important to recognize just how, I mean, it's not trade per se, but it is in a way. It's this made in China fentanyl and other opioids, right, that are stuffed into the arteries of the global trading system and wind up killing people in Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky. I mean, it's just so that's not Peter Navarro's world. That's not the world I want to live in. I don't want that world for any American. So that's an issue. I mean, what people forget that the Ricardian model and David Hume basically said that if you have trade between nations that is correct, you shouldn't have trade deficits. I don't know if you know this.
Yeah.
There's this thing called the gold specie flow adjustment mechanism, David Hume. It's like, you run a deficit, your currency is going to get cheaper, you'll buy fewer imports, export more, and it'll come back into balance. So that's not free trade. You know, that we don't see that Hume model. So, I mean, Europe sticks it to us, Japan sticks it to us, China sticks it to us. That's not free trade.
So I think something I'm curious about is the story you've told is very specific to both you and President Trump, in that you were two people who sort of saw this issue differently. Do you think future administrations, whether they're Democratic or Republican, are going to also be able to continue this framework, continue the framework of focusing on workers, continuing the framework of sort of your views on this economic policy? Because as you know, people in the mainstreams of both parties disagree. How sustainable do you think the approach is here?
I think that the China problem is fighting that is sustainable. I think that President Trump has done just a historic job. I think the history books will note this as one of his finest achievements, that he changed the narrative forever on China. I don't think there's any turning back on that. And part of the reason is that people understand it now, but also part of the reason is the Chinese don't seem to have any intention of moving in a better direction. They just double and triple down on everything they're doing right now, whether it's Orwellian control of their people through social credit scores, concentration camps in Xinjiang, artificial militarized islands in the South China Sea, the battle between freedom and democracy in Hong Kong versus authoritarianism. I mean, they're double, tripling, and quadrupling them down. So I think that's going to be with us, and that on a bipartisan basis will stand up. Now, never underestimate the power of Wall Street and the multinationals and the free traders to challenge that. I mean, I was aghast just a couple of weeks ago. You ought to get this letter and read it or something on the air. These economists came out, Nobel laureates, saying we're too tough on China. I mean,
yes, in the Washington Post, right?
Those guys need to get out a little bit more. Listen to a Pompeo speech or a Pence speech. Get a little broader view, and I thought that was it's just ignorant treason in a way, and they don't even know they're treasonous. But to talk like that is just silly.
I do want to get to, this is one thing I really want to focus on with you, which is you just described a dug-in, basically an enemy, which has no intention of changing its behavior. Why are we trying to sign a deal with them? We have signed many deals with them in the past. They've reneged and have cheated on every single one of them.
WTO, that's the
part
deal.
of the central story that you're telling is that PNTR, permanent normal trade relations with China, WTO membership with China, UN membership for China, their continual exploitation of the international system. What assurances would we have that if we even were to come to a deal with the Chinese government, that they would stick to it? I mean, I know the administration talks often about enforcement mechanisms, but I mean, it seems, there are enforcement mechanisms within the WTO. There are enforcement mechanisms between many of these other systems that we've designed, and none of these have reined in Chinese behavior. So just tell us why the administration thinks it's even possible to get a deal with the Chinese government.
So to be clear, the enforcement mechanism within the WTO is useless.
Right.
It just doesn't work. I mean, the enforcement mechanism is only as good as its architecture and design. To be equally clear, in the Phase 1 deal, the linchpin of that deal is an enforcement mechanism that would be put in place for all three phases of the deal. Now, what is the nature of that, and why would it actually work? First of all, it sets up a process to be done in Trump time, which is to say quickly. So the architecture is simply that if the United States Trade Representative believes that China is violating some aspect of the deal, the grievance is brought immediately to the attention to the other side at a high level. It's litigated over a short period of time, and the USTR, the U.S. Trade Rep, has the unilateral authority to impose remedies if he or she does not believe the grievance has been resolved. And not only that, China agrees not to retaliate in any way. Now, that's as good as it gets when it comes to an enforcement mechanism. Let's see if that's what emerges from the paper once this is papered. But that's the concept.
Could you, I think something that'd be, as a person who focused on the business sector, I think if you're looking at the controversy with the MBA in China, if you're looking at a lot of these companies who spent those 3 decades we've been talking about trying to break into the Chinese market, I think there's a very clear lack of understanding of these sort of dynamics, right? So if you're talking about the economists, they're looking at this just as an economic policy perspective. They're not looking at the domestic side of things. They're not looking at the foreign policy things. How do you think, as it was put on your business professor hat, how would you advise your MBAs if you were teaching today? How should they approach the China question?
Back when I was a professor, back when I was doing the work on China beginning in the mid-2000s, as I would go out and speak to corporate executive audiences quite frequently, I consistently told them, in no uncertain terms, that they were not properly assessing the geopolitical risk of being in China or the risk of losing their intellectual property and technology. They just simply were not doing it. And there was hubris across the land. Every one of these executives thought that they were going to be smarter than the Chinese, and they were going to be the exception to the rule that everybody else got ripped off. And I remember going face-to-face with Jeff Immelt at GE and just saying, what the hell are you doing? What are you doing? Do you really think that you're going to win this game? And he was just the most arrogant and cocky person I've ever met. And if you look at what GE is now compared to what it used to be, that's all about hubris. So that, it's the same thing. It's like the good news here is that as part of the awareness of the risks associated with China, there's not a lot of new foreign direct investment going into China.
Yeah.
Right?
Problem solved itself.
Yeah, look, go to Vietnam, Malaysia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, anywhere in between. But setting up your supply chain, I mean, think about it. It's like you're going to give corporations credit scores, right? So if they're not saluting the flag of China, they, their CEO could go to jail, they could get fined. It's just, it's crazy stuff.
That's the last thing I want to get to about is technology. So we have the, technology, a lot of these Chinese companies which do a business here.
By the way,
yes.
it's like, I think that what happened with the NBA was an important historical marker in U.S.-China relations, because it reached a segment of the population that would otherwise not pay attention to any of this. Certainly, there's a lot of sports fans that are politically active and aware of the China issue, but there's sure a lot of others that it's like it's not something they.
Right.
This kind of thing, it's like, oh, they bully us.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, LeBron James. Yeah, he was pretty critical of our president and other things when it didn't cost him any money, but boy, did he shut up quick when this with China. I mean, it affected a lot of people, and it's not going away. I mean, I can't look at a basketball game anymore the same way, particularly when LeBron or Steve Kerr or the San Antonio Spurs are playing. And yeah, I gotta love Shaq. I mean, I always thought Shaq. It's like I'm a Laker fan. I'm a Southern SoCal guy. It's right. It's like I used to watch him and Kobe go at it. And I was always like on the Shaq side of things, and it's like watching him go at it with Charles Barkley. It's like, this is cool.
We're gonna have to add add tape of
We'll
Shaq's
add that
statement
up on the tape so that the audience can see it. It is a great moment. I do encourage everyone. This is the last thing I do want to talk about with you. It's about technology, and it's about we have news recently that has been announced that the United States will be taking a national security review of the company called TikTok. Now, this is a social media platform that millions of American teenagers use. It's also owned by a Chinese company called ByteDance. This gets to a really critical question about technology and software in the American age, which is, should these Chinese companies be allowed to operate here in the United States when they are gathering vast amounts of data on American citizens? And we know, based on past experience, based on what you're talking about here, that data is not safe from the Chinese intelligence services by request.
That's the devil's bargain.
The devil's
if you're
bargain.
a Chinese company, you have to work with the Chinese government.
Yeah.
Well, it's not my place to make policy on the air in real time here, so I'm going to let the fabled interagency work that one out. But I have been watching with interest this debate and discussion over China's investment, or should I say? Let me be precise here. Right now, the board that oversees the federal retirement dollars of federal government employees in places like the Department of Defense, they made a preliminary decision to send significantly more money into Chinese companies that build the weapons that are aimed at us, right? And there was an op-ed by the Secretary of the Navy, Richard Spencer, that you should look at and maybe put a quote in as an aside to this podcast, maybe even have him here for the podcast. But it was quite eloquent in questioning that. So I think those are the kind of questions we have to be asking.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, sir. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for coming.
First time I got called sir all day. So I'll take it.
I'm sure that's
Thanks, sir.